All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today on our webinar. I hope everybody is staying safe. I know we've had a lot of difficult weather out there, so I hope everybody's staying safe. Today, the chair of the Appraisal Standards Board, Michelle Tchaikovsky-Bradley, will be summarizing the board's proposed changes to the 2023 USPAP. Michelle, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. Thanks for taking the time to attend this webinar today. As Lisa said, I am Michelle Tchaikovsky-Bradley. I am chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. I'm a certified general appraiser from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, southwestern Pennsylvania. I practice in the residential real property appraisal world. I'm also an AQB certified USPAP instructor and course author, all of which gives me very little free time, but I absolutely love it.
That is true. You are definitely a 24/7 appraiser, and I know you love every minute of it. So I'm Lisa Damaris, the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. I came here, it's been a little over a year and a half now, and prior to that, I spent about 30 years in the field as a residential appraiser. So let us begin here. But before we get into the real nuts and bolts of the webinar, I've got a few quick housekeeping notes I'm going to run through. As always, we record the webinar, and you're going to be able to see the recording post to our website and our YouTube channel in less than approximately 24 hours. And at the end of this presentation, we try to answer some questions if we have time. So if you want to ask a question, just take your mouse to the bottom of the screen and you're going to see that kind of newer Q&A feature. That's where we really want you to have your questions. So if you have a question, put them in the Q&A box. I'm going to keep my eye on that. I know there's the chat box there as well, and you're going to see information in there. We'd like you to use the chat box more for comments so I can kind of keep them straight, but it's okay if you mix them up. We've got Joellen behind the scenes kind of copying and pasting things if we need, but if you can use the Q&A button for the questions, that would be great. And at the very conclusion of the webinar, we're going to have, right as soon as the webinar ends, a very quick survey pops up. We would just ask you to take a moment. It just is very quick to fill it out so we can always improve our webinars as we go along. All right, then for our agenda today, we are going to discuss the 8 sections of the first exposure draft. Michelle and I are going to do our best to explain the rationale. We'll show up to most of the explaining for the proposed changes issued by the board. And then as previously stated, Michelle will be answering questions at the very end, and we're going to just conclude with some very quick information on next steps for you. But first, I'm so excited to tell you about the new exposure draft format. You may have noticed that the exposure draft format has been redesigned to be more user-friendly and easier to read. So in the first part of the document, you will have the rationale for the changes, followed by the proposed change in a much more clean, simplified style. And the second part of the document, that's where you see the appendix. The appendix has the complete detailed proposed changes with deletions in strike through and additions in underline. So all of these sections are interlinked, so you can easily navigate back and forth through the document on your computer. So if you prefer the clean or the simplified style of the proposed changes, you now have them. But if you like a traditional style with the complete underlines and the strike through, then you just go to the appendix. So let us know what you think about the new draft. You may not have any comments right now, but if you don't, you can always send them to us later as you spend more time with the document. The foundation and its board is always working to strive to improve, so all feedback is absolutely appreciated. And along with this new exposure draft format, we also have a new comment format. So in the spirit of improvements, we've created a more user-friendly way for you to submit your comments. Because the traditional, please email your comments method, besides that method, it's still available to you. You can always email your comments to us. We absolutely get those and read all of those. We're providing you a couple more alternatives. When you open up a document, you can just click on, there's a comments link in the exposure drafts, and it takes you to a platform where you can either upload your document of comments, so a PDF or a Word document, or you can actually just comment right there in the screen and it gets downloaded to us in a very usable format. And all of those go right to the ASB. Michelle, do you have any comments on the formatting?
You know, Lisa, I already see people putting in the chat box that they love the new format. So this is fantastic. The new format's very user-friendly. We're very excited to have both the new exposure draft and the new comment method. The discussion draft received so many comments, and the engagement during that discussion draft webinar was just extraordinary. And we're certainly hoping to keep that momentum going for this exposure draft. We certainly appreciate the efforts by the foundation and my fellow board members to continue to evolve and improve this process. So the Appraisal Standards Board released the first exposure draft back on August 18th. It seems like a long time ago already, but it was only a few short weeks, accepting comments through October 11th. But we know that you are all going to be so excited about what you hear today, kind of bringing to life what you've read already, maybe with the first exposure draft. We know you're going to be so excited, you're probably going to want to chime in well before the October 11th timeframe. As our viewers might know, our board regularly solicits and receives comments and suggestions for improving USPAP. Proposed changes are intended to improve USPAP understanding and enforcement, and of course, to achieve the goal of promoting and maintaining public trust in appraisal practice.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. So having that lay out the groundwork, let's go inside the exposure draft and look at the areas that the board is proposing changes for. So you want to start and lead us through these?
Thank you very much. Let's peek inside, as Lisa said. So here on your screen, you're going to see the 8 sections the board is reviewing. We will have the proposed changes on the screen. Of course, you can always open up the first exposure draft if you'd like to have it on your screen, make it simple for yourself. So I have the page numbers on there for you. If you prefer to just listen and follow along, you can do that as well. So based on various feedback from prior exposure drafts and many other sources, the Appraisal Standards Board is currently considering these areas of proposed changes for the 2023, seems so long, 2023 edition of USPAP. And I want to be very clear about something when I focus on that 2023, folks. I want to be very clear that although this edition is labeled 2023 USPAP, its end date is undetermined due to the very lengthy process in promulgating a new edition of USPAP. The public will absolutely be given at least a full year's notice in advance of any new edition becoming effective. So on your screen, you'll see sections 1 through 8. And again, those page numbers that you see on your screen, those are the page numbers for the actual discussion draft if you have that printed out, if you're old school like me, or if you want to just flip to those pages on your electronic format.
Thanks, Michelle. In looking at these, and I know that people who've been following all the exposure drafts over time and the different topics the board has studied, that I can see the overlap and the evolution of the topics from just the discussion draft even into this first exposure draft. So I'm really looking forward to you having us dive into all of these. Let's get started with section 1. This is the ethics rule. Can you tell us why the board is proposing changes to the ethics rule?
Yes, Lisa, let me, before we start with that, let me dive in to the why we are proposing changes to this section before I get into explaining what we are actually proposing. So let me dive backwards here for a moment. Of course, recently, we all know that there has been intense media focus on issues relating to discrimination, to fair housing, to property values. These issues are, taken as a whole, very complex. They involve layers of social, economic, urban planning matters, most of which go well beyond USPAP. However, since appraisal is just one facet of the greater mortgage lending process, the appraisal body of knowledge, and the appraisal process itself have become part of the discussion. So more specifically, there have been discussions about comparable sales selection by appraisers and questions about how appraisers support some of their conclusions related to value. Now, of course, the ASB does not own or control the general appraisal body of knowledge, and of course, therefore, cannot establish or amend practices related to the appropriate selection of data in any valuation assignment. However, the conduct section of the ethics rule is very clear. An appraiser must not perform an assignment with bias. Can't be more clear. Further, the conduct section of the ethics rule goes on to state the second bullet point that's on your screen, which says an appraiser must not use or rely on unsupported conclusions related to the characteristics, the ones that are noted on your screen, or an unsupported conclusion that homogeneity of such characteristics is necessary to maximize value. So after issuing the discussion draft a few months ago on this topic, the ASB received feedback not only from appraisers, but also from those in the appraisal regulatory arena. Several comments received back to the board made the point that the above sentence, the one that I just read, contains a reference to unsupported opinions and conclusions, which might be interpreted to imply that a supported opinion or conclusion based on certain characteristics of people may be acceptable. Now, Advisory Opinion 16, which is guidance that illustrates the applicability of USPAP in specific situations, but of course we know is not a part of USPAP, it's guidance, offers some clarity on this issue. Now I'm going to read this very important section up on my screen here. For those of you that are listening and not watching on video, I'm going to read this because this is really critical. Let me get to it here. In some cases, even supported conclusions in assignments relating to characteristics such as race, color, religion, national origin, gender, marital status, familial status, age, receipt of public assistance income, handicap, or group homogeneity cannot be used because, I'm going to pause here, because they are precluded by applicable law. Now, given that the advisory opinion is an illustration of the applicability of USPAP, but it's not actually part of USPAP itself. Again, remember, advisory opinions are guidance material. They're not actually part of the USPAP document. So given that it's an advisory opinion and not part of USPAP, the argument has been made that in the best interest of public trust, the ASB should consider adding language to the ethics rule to answer the question, are supported conclusions based on the listed characteristics allowed under USPAP? Now, folks, this question has largely come from government regulatory agencies. The agencies have expressed concern that real property appraisers may incorrectly conclude that a supported conclusion related to the noted characteristics of protected classes is appropriate to use, even in situations where those considerations may be in violation of state and federal laws. So why here? Why the ethics rule? How did we land here? The ethics rule applies to all appraisers. The ethics rule applies to all assignments. The ethics rule is applicable for all appraisal disciplines. It's always applicable. And it is a part of USPAP itself. It's not guidance material, it's part of USPAP. And it's not just that advisory opinion. So further, the ethics rule specifies the personal obligations and the responsibilities of the individual appraiser. It's not meant to address additional requirements for different types of appraisal or appraisal review assignments. And it's for that reason, therefore, that any requirements in the ethics rule cannot just be written to address just one appraisal discipline, because the ethics rule applies to all disciplines. So we can't single out one discipline in the ethics rule. When I talk about appraisal disciplines, I'm referring to real property, personal property, business valuation. We can't single out one discipline because the ethics rule applies to all. The ethics rule also can't be written to reflect individual laws that apply to every different appraisal or appraisal review assignment. But here's what the ethics rule can do. The ethics rule can include, in the form of a comment, an interpretation to establish the general context and condition for the application of supported conclusions based upon those characteristics of protected classes. Importantly, folks, the adoption of this comment will make it clear that a supported conclusion related to the characteristics of these protected classes is the exception. It is not the rule. The language proposed to be added to the ethics rule is written to address a few points related to supported conclusions based on the noted characteristics of protected classes. Let me go through some of the bullet points that are on your screen. The ethics rule, again, applicable to all disciplines: real property, personal property, business valuation. Laws that are applicable to each appraisal or appraisal review assignment vary greatly by each assignment. Yet fair housing laws apply only to real property appraisals. Supported conclusions based on any of the characteristics listed in the ethics rule may violate state or federal laws regarding discrimination in most instances for real property residential appraisal. Supported conclusions related to listed characteristics may not violate laws in other instances. I'd love to give you an example because the board is asked this all the time. For example, if a business appraisal is being completed on a business that makes products, for example, for one specific ethnic group, the business appraisal would likely need to use supported conclusions based on the characteristics of the group of people that that specific business serves. That makes sense. Taking all of that into consideration, the ASB is proposing to add a comment to part of the ethics rule. This one comment will establish the context and establish the conditions for using supported conclusions. Now, if adopted, the new comment in the ethics rule would appear as noted on your screen. I'll just pause for a moment so you can all take a peek at that. The comment says, in most instances, even supported conclusions based on one or more of the characteristics noted above must be avoided. Supported conclusions based on the characteristics of protected classes may be allowed if those conclusions are not precluded by applicable law and necessary for credible assignment results and based on relevant evidence and logic.
Thank you, Michelle. That was a lot, but I know it was important that you wanted to get that all in there, give everybody really sufficient information on everything. So I think now you had told me you had wanted to ask everybody a question.
I do. Folks, this is part of the webinar that we really want to hear from you. This is not a lecture. This is an interactive webinar. I'd very much like to hear you get your fingers ready and start clacking away on your keyboard. Here's what I want to hear from you. Do you think additional guidance is needed to explain or clarify this proposed change? This is very, very important to hear back from you. You've always heard ASB members say that we read every comment. We absolutely do. But we also want this type of interaction from you as well. We want to engage with stakeholders and the public. You all took the time out of your busy schedules to listen to this webinar right before a holiday weekend. So please give us some feedback on that.
Thanks, Michelle. And I know that your enthusiasm for the profession always gets people all juiced up to get some providers. Oh, see, there we go. There's some comments coming in right now. So thank you, everybody. We do give these to the ASB, like Michelle says, very, very important. So please put your comments in there. But while you're thinking about that or you're getting your comments ready, Michelle's going to move on here. We're going to move into the personal inspection and the certification. This is a big one to explain as well. You want to tell us about it, Michelle?
I will be happy to tell you about this. I feel like I am living and breathing this. What can't I tell you about it for certain? We know that each written appraisal report must contain a signed certification, which must address certain elements. Boy, look at all the comments coming in the comment box, the chat box. I love it. Keep going. Okay. So the ASB is proposing that one of these elements in the mandatory certification be removed from the certification and moved into reporting standards that relate to scope of work. And in moving this requirement, slightly changing the exact reporting requirements. Now I'll get into that in just a minute. This is up on your screen and it's in italics for you to read along. I prefer to call this the I have or have not made a personal inspection element of the certification. So if you hear me say I have or have not, we're talking about that element of the certification. Now, I want to note, this is really key. I want to note that moving this out of the certification, folks, is going to have no impact on the requirement to consider if an inspection is necessary for credible assignment results. And folks, that's because this proposed change is related only to reporting requirements. Now, I'm going to say that again because that is so key. I don't want anybody to miss that concept. So I'm going to say it again. Moving the I have or have not requirement out of the certification is going to have no impact, zero impact on the requirement to consider if an inspection is necessary for credible assignment results. That's because this proposed change is a reporting requirement only. This is not a change to a development requirement.
This is getting very interesting, Michelle.
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us why the ASB is proposing this?
I would love to. So, of course, right now, the I have or have not statement in the certification, well, it's related to this very narrow concept of an appraiser's personal inspection. The ASB is proposing to move this out of the certification, which will remove all references of personal inspection. So in other words, this will result in making a personal inspection and an inspection the same thing. Now, don't get excited. We're going to explain that all to you. When we think about that I have or have not statement, what we contemplated, if this particular element of the certification provides any real clarity today. In today's world, what does that really say? Does it really say what the appraiser did as part of performing the scope of work in that assignment? To say, I have made a personal inspection of the subject property, well, that was pretty clear historically, wasn't it? Historically, everybody understood what that meant. But today, technology has increased opportunities for how appraisers conduct an inspection. Moving this statement out of the certification, sliding it over there into the reporting requirements doesn't delete the requirement. Instead, it allows the appraiser increased flexibility. Did you hear that? Increased flexibility in reporting how data is gathered regarding the subject in the assignment. Now, the ASB is proposing the deletion of the definition of personal inspection. I'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay, so if this does happen, does this mean that the appraiser no longer has to disclose if they did or did not perform an inspection?
That is an absolutely great question. And no, it is not a correct statement. USPAP has always required the appraisal report to contain information that indicates whether the appraiser has or has not personally inspected the subject property. Folks, think about that for a moment. Sometimes we in our minds, we think about making that statement that we did, but we don't maybe realize that USPAP has always required that. It has always been a requirement to state whether you have or have not made a personal inspection of the subject property. So this proposed change will simply move the current requirement out of the certification and add this concept right into the reporting standards that address the scope of work disclosure. Conceptually, one could say that this isn't a deletion at all. Instead, it's simply a movement of the requirement into the reporting standards. And in moving that requirement, some of the nuances in how the appraiser would report information about an inspection will change slightly.
Okay, so on the screen now is a quick example of the proposal that we will be moving on quickly. You can find this in Appendix 2 of the exposure draft, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes. Right now, Michelle, I know you have another question for everybody you want to ask to get those comments churning again.
I do, and I love the interaction, folks. So many comments are coming in that I don't want to pay attention to the slideshow. I want to read the comments, but rest assured, I will read every one of them, as will every board member who are watching right now as well. Here's the question for you now. Is the guidance in AO 31, that's appraisals involving more than one appraiser, is it sufficient? And if not, what areas of practice require additional guidance and illustrations? Now, folks, AO 31, if you have not read those illustrations lately, that is your homework assignment for the holiday weekend. Everybody has to go and read those illustrations because we want to know. We need to know. We don't operate in a vacuum. We want to know from you if that is sufficient, if you find that helpful, and if there's anything else that you need.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So let us move right along to section 3. This is disclosure in reporting.
Yes. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, if we remove that I have or have not statement, the ASB is proposing to add language to a comment in reporting standards 2, 4, 6, and 8. That's because the ASB, importantly, acknowledges the appraisal report must still include disclosures specifically related to inspections or the lack thereof. On the screen is an example of this proposed language addition. Specifically, we're showing you standards 2-2A. The addition that we're proposing is underlined on your screen. And again, I am going to read that for those of you who are listening without video. When an inspection was performed as part of the scope of work, summarize the type and extent of the inspection. In instances where an inspection was not performed as part of the scope of work, state that no inspection was performed. So folks, if this is adopted, this will allow the appraisers more flexibility and the responsibility, of course, to accurately communicate one of two things: the type and extent of the appraiser's inspection performed as part of the scope of work, and if the appraiser did not perform an inspection. It's very key. It's always been there. Now, in this proposed edit, the key language includes performed as part of the scope of work. Very important distinction here, because disclosure in the appraisal report is necessary only when the inspection is performed as part of the scope of work. This language here makes it very clear to clients and intended users what part of any inspection that may have been completed was performed by the same appraiser who is completing the appraisal or appraisal review assignment, and importantly, helps protect public trust.
So on the screen now, you will see the proposed changes for an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. We can leave them up here for just a minute, but you can also find these in section 3 in the exposure draft, as well as in appendix 3. So I'll just let you see them real quick. Okay, now Michelle, let's move on to section 4. What can you tell us about transfers and sales?
So this is a real interesting one. It has been brought to the ASB's attention that while a sale of a property is essentially a transfer of a property, there is a minor technical difference between the two. A sale is always a transfer, but a transfer may not always technically include a sale. Now, this impacts appraisers in all disciplines: real property, personal property, and business valuation. But it is really of particular importance to the business valuation appraisers. In business valuation, sales are often structured in ways that are not considered true sales, if you will. They include reorganizations, mergers, or even partial transfers of businesses. Now, USPAP guidance has always maintained that a sale and a transfer are essentially the same, but enough questions have been raised about the issue that the ASB is now proposing this change.
Okay, and then on the screen here, you're going to notice again, here's the addition of and other transfers for standards rule 1-5. That's the example here, and you can view the rest of the changes in appendix 4.
Yeah.
And now, Michelle, time for one of your questions.
Yep. It's time to engage you again, folks. I have lots of homework assignments for you. I want to hear from you. The board needs to hear from you. Do you encounter transfers that are not technically sales in your daily practice? And if you do, how do you envision this proposed change to impact your practice? We want to hear the responses from you. So you can put it in the chat box or you can send us emails after, but we do want to hear from you.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. All right. The next 3 sections of the webinar and of the exposure draft all have to do with definitions. So we're going to start with definitions that the ASB is proposing to retire, including the definitions of misleading, relevant characteristics, and personal inspection. So Michelle, you want to walk us through these?
Of course. So misleading, we will start with first. The definition of misleading is being proposed for deletion, which means that the term will revert to its common dictionary definition. Relevant characteristics. The definition of relevant characteristics is being proposed for deletion as well, because the current wording could be interpreted to mean that relevant characteristics must be concluded prior to the appraiser determining and performing the scope of work. And also personal inspection. So the ASB has proposed a change to the certification statement, as we have explained, regarding that personal inspection element. And therefore, the definition of personal inspection would no longer be necessary if that continues. USPAP will now leave it up to the appraiser, of course, in communication with the client, to determine if an inspection is necessary, if the inspection will be part of the scope of work performed, or if the client will have a property inspection done outside the appraisal assignment. If an inspection is needed, well, what type of inspection should be done? And if an inspection is needed, to what extent that inspection should be done.
Oh, wow. This is a great way to look at the issue. And I hope that everyone thinks through this when making their comments back to the board. So we are now onto the definitions that the ASB is proposing to modify. This includes appraiser, assignment elements, and work file. Michelle, take it away.
So the ASB is proposing to reinstate a comment that was present in the 2018-19 edition of USPAP. That comment was removed for 2020, and the ASB realized that important information is contained in that comment to help understand that definition fully, namely where the expectation that an appraiser has an obligation to comply with USPAP. So just for clarity, the previous comment from the 2018-19 is being proposed to be added back in verbatim. Our next proposed modification is for the definition of assignment elements. The current definition includes a list of assignment elements which are applicable in every appraisal assignment. However, there are a few circumstances the assignment elements listed in the definition may not be the exact ones that are applicable in some appraisal review assignments. So the board felt instead of listing assignment elements separately for both appraisal and appraisal review, the ASB proposes to remove the listing and simply include specific information needed to identify the appraisal or appraisal review problem as it appears on your screen there. And finally, the ASB proposes to modify the definition of work file. So the preamble states that an appraiser must maintain the data, information, analysis necessary to support his or her opinions for appraisal or appraisal review assignments. So what does that say? That says that the main purpose of the work file is to contain the documentation necessary to support the appraiser's opinions and conclusions. Therefore, the ASB is proposing the change that's visible on your screen now. Documentation necessary to support the appraiser's opinions and conclusions.
And for this last one, I know that the ASB behind the scenes, this one has taken literally hours and hours. I mean, probably 100 or so hours have gone into discussing pronouns and how do you update those. And it turned out to not be as simple and straightforward as y'all had hoped. So it looks like you're working on proposing to add a definition related to pronouns, correct?
That is correct. And you know, to take off on what you said, Lisa, that's so true. I would love for everybody who took time out of their schedule to get involved with the Appraisal Foundation, take the opportunity to volunteer your time and see kind of what goes on behind the scenes. It's absolutely fascinating, the brain trust that is part of this organization. So we got all this brain trust together and we started looking at the change to pronouns for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we went through so many hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of discussions on how to do this simply, easily, without changing anything in the document. When I say we've been working diligently studying this, I can't impress upon you all enough. So currently we're looking at the pronouns. We're talking about the he or the she, the his, the her. The ASB's weighed so many different options. We've spoken with legal counsel. We have engaged DEI, diversity, inclusion, equity and inclusion experts. This proposed definition is intended for respectability, for respect of all individuals. It's clarifying exactly what the use of these words, he, she, his, her, are meant to convey for respect to all individuals. It does not result in an unintended change to the content of USPAP by simply adding this definition.
Great. Thanks for that really thorough explanation of that, because I know it looks so simple on the screen, but it was just so time consuming. Okay, now we're going to move on to section 8, and these are just the minor edits, this last section of the exposure draft.
Yeah.
And Michelle, thank you for taking us through all these changes. So why don't you forge on and get us through this last section here?
Absolutely. So in this last section, these proposed changes, as Lisa said, they are more minor, but nonetheless, they are still very important. So thank you all for sticking with us and taking this to the end of the webinar. So the ASB is proposing to replace the word summary with description in one sentence in each of the certification requirements. It's on your screen so you can see what it is that we're talking about. These are in the certification requirements for standards 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Now, depending on, of course, what your reporting option is that you're using, the appraiser is required to, at a minimum, either state or summarize the extent of the assistance. So to be certain that both options are encapsulated in the requirement, the ASB is proposing to replace the word summary with description just to avoid any confusion. There is a minor change to standard 6 on the next screen. This is a real quick explanation. Standard 6 addresses how an appraiser should report the results of a mass appraisal. The ASB has always held that Standard 6 does not include an option for an oral report. However, this wasn't actually directly stated. So because some stakeholders have inquired about this recently, the ASB proposes the current edit to the opening line of Standard 6, just so it is abundantly clear. And on the next slide, our last proposed actually minor change is on this section here. It's Issue Standards Rule 8-2. This is a very simple one. The proposed change is just to add words for consistent words in 8-2A versus 8-2B. So this change has already been exposed previously for adoption. There were no notable objections. This is not a concept change or any kind of added requirement. It's just to bring the words internally consistent in 8-2A and 8-2B. The proposal is on the screen for everyone to view. Wow, look at all the chat box questions. I'm so excited. Thank you for engaging, everybody.
You do a good job of getting everybody engaged, Michelle. Thank you for that. And thank you for taking us through this exposure draft. So Michelle has covered all of the main points of the exposure draft. And now I've got some questions here that have been churning along. And I had a couple of questions that people did send in ahead of time. So we're going to kind of go back and forth between the two. Michelle, are you ready for the Q&A part of the?
I think so.
You are. This question is probably, it makes sense. It's a great question. And it's something that we addressed in the new 7-hour USPAP update course. And it has to do with the supported conclusions. In the course, we include an example of what a supported conclusion would look like for a real property appraiser, and that's related to the age restriction. Do you want to kind of explain that a little bit to her, what that means, that you can have a supported conclusion in a real property appraisal?
Yes, so great question. So a supported conclusion, let me back up for just a moment and remind everyone that USPAP covers all disciplines. Sometimes when we are engaged in our own personal appraisal discipline, our own personal appraisal practice, we kind of get those blinders on and think that what we do is the only part of the appraisal profession. But when you kind of open up those blinders, you realize there's so many facets in the appraisal profession. There's so many different disciplines. There's so many different unique parts of each individual discipline. So if a business valuation appraiser were engaged to value whether a shop owner, whether a business owner should renew their lease in a particular market, that owner of that business who may make a particular product that appeals to a particular ethnic group, they want to know, is there sufficient people who are going to buy my product? So they may engage an appraiser in business valuation to tell them whether they should renew their lease in a particular market. So remember that USPAP covers multiple disciplines. It needs to be flexible for that reason, and that's why supported conclusions are necessary.
Okay, great. I have a question here. As I expected, we're getting most of these questions are about the inspection related topic you have in there. So here's the first one. Moving the inspection information and in reading the new requirements, can you explain how an appraiser is supposed to meet these proposed requirements if they're adopted?
Yeah, that's a great question. So by way of answer, let me say that, boy, there's going to be a lot of nuances to that. The answer to that question is really, well, which discipline are you in? What's your area of specialty? So instead of giving one answer, I can't give an umbrella of answers, too broad of a topic, but instead of walking through very specific details, just know that if this change is adopted, every discipline is going to understand how to implement it. Don't worry, the ASB is not going to leave anyone hanging out there for answers. If this is adopted, there will most likely be a new advisory opinion and guidance that will explain all the nuances for the disciplines.
That's a great point, Michelle, because I know watching the board work in action, they recognize that these few simple sentences give great power to the appraiser, but also brought up a lot of questions that you can answer through an advisory opinion. So thanks for making that clear. Let's see here. The client, if a client knows that I did not inspect the property, so if the client knows I did not inspect the property, why do I have to tell them about that in the report?
So if the client already knows that you, as the appraiser, have not inspected the property, why do I need to tell them that in the report? Okay, that's a great question. I'm sure many people are probably thinking the same thing. So really there are two reasons. So first, USPAP has always required the appraiser to state whether they've made an inspection or have not made an inspection. That's always been a requirement. But secondly, because the public is now somewhat confused, misled, if you will, about the client's role in the property inspection, the client can now dictate what the property inspection will consist of. Sometimes it seems almost that the appraiser's client is shielding the property owner from even knowing that a third-party inspector has no relationship to the appraiser or appraisal. The public does not know or understand that the inspection can now be a secondary source of property data to the appraiser, as opposed to a primary source of property data when the appraiser is there themselves gathering that data.
I think what you're talking about, like the hybrid situation where somebody hires whoever, be it an appraiser, whoever, to do an inspection as one assignment, and then the appraisal assignment is something completely different. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly the point. The ASB has heard situations where homeowners have been confused as to whether the individual who just entered their home was an appraiser or is not an appraiser. And so that lack of entering that data in the report, why take that out? It's important. Again, USPAP has always required the appraiser to state whether they have made that inspection or have not. And there's really no valid reason to remove that.
Great. I still have questions on the inspection issue.
Yeah,
we expected that. Which is great.
That's great. I love having
this format. Okay.
Right.
If the ASB removes your element of the certification, also I'm assuming they're talking about your I have not of the certification, then why don't you just drop it? Drop the whole concept of needing to specifically report any details about an inspection.
So why not just drop the whole thing if we're going to move it out of the certification and move it into the reporting standards relating to scope of work? Really great intuitive questions, folks. So it's not possible to just drop it, again, because USPAP has always required the appraiser to indicate one of two things. I have made the inspection or I have not made the inspection. Of course, depending on applicable disciplines. So moving that requirement out of the certification and into that scope of work reporting requirements, folks, that does not create a new requirement in and of itself, but it does highlight an aspect about reporting the information about that inspection. And that's explained in advisory opinion too, something that I feel like I have ingrained in my chiseled in my memory. I think I can recite verbatim. The board has been discussing that for so long. I'm thinking of the sentence, all appraisal reports must contain sufficient information to allow intended users to understand the extent of the inspection. Lisa, I'm going to have you look that up for me.
No, I have AO2. I have AO2 open here because it's dog-eared at this point. But yes, I think you read that.
It's in disclosure requirements. I think it's like 80 or 90, line 80 or 90.
See, 89. You're ridiculous.
I sleep with USPAP under my pillow at night. I get a very good night's sleep because I sleep with USPAP under my pillow. It's just osmosis. It kind of floats right up there. That's really important. So our new wording, folks, it doesn't create a situation where USPAP is suddenly and unreasonably placing a greater emphasis on the property inspection than it ever has before. The proposed changes are just making it clear that if the appraiser's inspection was performed as part of the scope of work, it's key, it's part of the scope of work, it lets the appraiser define what an inspection is. Complete flexibility by reporting specific details about the type and the extent of that inspection.
That's great. And there's actually part 2 to this question. But before I go to that, I just want to say some of the other questions I have here in the Q&A box were asking that. They were like, why can't you get rid of the definition of inspection, or it's too hard to define? So what you're saying is this is giving them the power to explain that what it is themselves by explaining the type and the extent. So along those same lines, the proposed requirement refers to, like you just mentioned, the type and extent of the inspection. That looks like a new requirement. So has an appraiser always had to report information regarding the type and the extent of an inspection?
So that's not a great follow-up question. That's not a new requirement in and of itself, but it does highlight an aspect about reporting the information about the inspection. So of course, both the appraisal report and the restricted appraisal report require the appraiser to describe the scope of work performed. The inspection is part of the scope of work, and if one's performed, USPAP has always required the appraiser to include sufficient information about that inspection. But the one thing that the scope of work reporting obligation hasn't required is the statement that an inspection has not been conducted. So if we were to just remove the personal inspection element out of that certification, that removes the appraiser's requirement to state if they did not perform that inspection. And there's just simply not a logical reason to remove that.
Okay, then this is a simple question, and so it just falls right in with what you're saying here. Why are you guys even proposing removing this at all? Like at this point in time, why? Where's the rationale? What's the reasoning behind how this kind of bubbled up to the surface?
I just love that somebody asked that question. I was so hoping that somebody would be so smart to chime in. So, well, first, folks, there's a whole bunch of reasons. I'm going to hit a few highlights. Changes in technology have blurred the line between a personal inspection conducted by an appraiser and just an inspection in general. That line between personal inspection by an appraiser and an inspection in general, it's blurred now. And let me just add, folks, that technology is not going to stop. My 80-year-old dad is not thrilled with smartphones. He still looks at that smartphone and says, it doesn't work. I just wanted to make a phone call. Technology is not going to stop. It's going to continue to increase, whether appraisers like it or not. So an example, let me give you a couple examples of how that personal inspection and inspection in general have kind of blurred. Using a drone to view 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres of property out in Wyoming somewhere. It's probably a lot better using a drone than going and driving to the property and stepping your big toe on the front property boundary and saying, I made a personal inspection. Using that drone can give you a better view of that property in many instances than simply walking up to the property, putting your big toe on that property and saying, I've made a personal inspection. Let me give you another good example. And folks, did we learn this during COVID or what? During COVID, having a homeowner FaceTime us with the appraiser kind of walking around, the appraiser sitting there, having the homeowner walk around the property, having the appraiser say, Mr. Homeowner, go over to that area. Ms. Homeowner, go over to that area, zoom in. May that reasonably be considered a personal inspection? Maybe, maybe not. But with the certification we have right now, the appraiser's not on site, so they can't call it a personal inspection. So see how those lines have been blurred? And that's because of technology, and not just technology, society. We found this out during the pandemic, some of the problems we've had. There have been changes in how clients order appraisals. These changes are leading the public, the property owners, to think the person visiting my home is associated with the appraisal, when in fact they might not be. Moving that requirement into the scope of work reporting allows us to draw this bright line, get a big yellow highlighter and highlight that line. It allows us to draw this line between two people, one who inspects improvements but is not completing or even working on the appraisal. And secondly, one who conducts the inspection as an appraiser for the assignment, because we know that only a appraiser can perform the scope of work. And when one is done, the inspection is part of the scope of work performed by the appraiser.
Great answer, Michelle. That was wonderful. We're going to wrap up
excited.
Here. I know you do. I'm just going to real quickly read a comment that an AQB certified USPAP instructor, a qualified USPAP instructor has typed into the box, and they said regarding this topic, we are asking a very specific outdated question right now that I have or have not is an outdated question, which doesn't really give any real information. So the intent right now is to give that power to the appraiser to define what that inspection is. And that's what he's basically saying. So, all right, real quick, we're going to wrap up. We want to hear from you. The comment deadline is October 11th of 2021. You can submit your comments. You can visit, there's the link there, or it's also posted in the chat box. Michelle and her whole gang of fabulous ASB members will be having a public meeting on October the 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Michelle, any last words before we sign off here?
I just want to say that not only do we read every comment, we digest them. We dissect them. Even if you just give us thumbs up or thumbs down, that's helpful, but would really like to hear your rationale. We want to know what you're experiencing so that we can make the best decisions in the interest of public trust.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Please fill out the survey at the end. The questions that we did not answer, we're going to use those. They're actually very good questions that we're going to use as the basis for the AO that you guys rewrite if you adopt this. Otherwise, thank you for being with us here today, and we sure hope to hear from you.